Imagine waking up one morning to find yourself staring at an exact copy of you in your bedroom mirror. But this reflection isn't mimicking your movements. Instead, it's waving at you, trying to warn you about something. As you reach out to touch the glass, you realize with growing horror that this other you claims to be your actual self, and that you are the reflection who has somehow gained consciousness. But if you're the reflection, then whose memories are you experiencing? And if you're the real person, how can you be sure that your entire life hasn't been lived inside a mirror, with your reflection now breaking free? This mind-bending scenario introduces us to the mirror of consciousness paradox, just one of the reality-shattering puzzles we'll explore in our journey through the most perplexing paradoxes ever conceived. Each one has the power to fundamentally alter how you perceive reality, existence, and your own consciousness. But before we dive deeper into the mirror, let's understand why paradoxes have such a powerful effect on our minds. Our brains evolved to make sense of the physical world around us, to understand cause and effect, to recognize patterns, and to create logical frameworks that help us survive and thrive. Paradoxes are like viruses in this mental operating system, presenting us with scenarios that seem to follow logical rules but lead to impossible or contradictory conclusions. The mirror of consciousness paradox is particularly disturbing because it attacks something we take for granted, our sense of self. We assume we're the original, the real version, experiencing authentic memories and thoughts. But how can we be certain every memory you have of looking in a mirror could be from the perspective of the reflection? Every moment you've lived could be a mirrored version of reality. Consider this. When you look in a mirror, you're not actually seeing yourself as others see you. You're seeing a reversed image. Your left hand appears as your right in the reflection. So which version is correct? The way you see yourself or the way others see you? And if your entire existence has been as a reflection, would you even be able to tell the difference? This paradox becomes even more complex when we consider quantum mechanics. According to quantum theory, particles can exist in multiple states simultaneously until they're observed. What if consciousness works the same way? What if every time you look in a mirror, both you and your reflection exist in a superposition of states, both real and reflected, until the act of observation forces one reality to collapse into existence? But here's where it gets truly mind-bending. The act of observation requires consciousness. So, who's doing the observing? You or your reflection? And if consciousness is required for observation, but observation is required to determine which consciousness is real, we've created an infinite loop of causality that threatens to unravel the very fabric of reality. As you ponder these questions, you might feel a subtle shift in your perception. The next time you look in a mirror, you might find yourself wondering, really wondering, which side of the glass you're on. This uncertainty, this crack in the foundation of your reality, is exactly what makes paradoxes so powerful and so unsettling. The mirror of consciousness. Paradox is just our first step into the labyrinth of logical impossibilities we'll explore. Each paradox we encounter will challenge another fundamental assumption about reality, consciousness, time, or existence. Some might leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the universe. Others might reveal hidden truths about the nature of thought itself. But remember, the discomfort you feel when confronting these paradoxes isn't a weakness of your mind. It's a sign that your consciousness is expanding, pushing against the boundaries of conventional thought. Like a mental workout that leaves your brain pleasantly sore, these paradoxes exercise parts of your mind that rarely get challenged in everyday life. As we continue our journey through increasingly complex paradoxes, keep this in mind. The goal isn't to solve these puzzles. Many of them have no solution. That's what makes them paradoxes. Instead, the goal is to understand why they break our normal ways of thinking and what that reveals about the nature of thought, reality, and existence itself. Are you ready to have your mind thoroughly melted? Because the Mirror of Consciousness paradox was just the beginning. We're about to dive into even deeper waters, exploring paradoxes that have puzzled philosophers, mathematicians, and physicists for centuries. Some of what you're about to encounter may change the way you think about reality forever. Let's begin our descent into the depths of paradox. Now that we've cracked open the door to paradoxical thinking with our mirror scenario, let's dive into what might be the most unsettling paradox of human consciousness, the infinite regression of self. This paradox starts with a simple question that quickly spirals into an abyss of uncertainty. When you think about yourself thinking, who is doing the thinking about the thinking? Take a moment to try this. Think about what you had for breakfast this morning. Simple enough, right? Now, think about yourself thinking about breakfast. You can do that too. You can picture yourself remembering breakfast. But now think about yourself thinking about yourself thinking about breakfast. Keep going. Think about yourself thinking about yourself thinking about yourself thinking about breakfast. With each layer, you're creating a new you that's observing the previous you. It's like pointing two mirrors at each other. You create an infinite tunnel of reflections, each one slightly smaller than the last. But unlike mirrors, which simply reflect light, each layer of your self-awareness is actually a distinct mental act. Each requires a new you to perform it. This leads us to a troubling question. Who is the final observer? Who is the ultimate you that's doing all this thinking? Every time you try to locate this final self, you create another layer of observation, another you doing the observing. It's like trying to catch your own shadow. The faster you chase it, the faster it moves away. Some philosophers argue that this infinite regression reveals something profound about consciousness. Perhaps what we think of as our self isn't a single, unified entity at all, but rather a series of mental processes observing each other. Your sense of being a continuous singular person might be an illusion created by these layered observations. Consider this practical experiment. Try to catch yourself in the act of falling asleep. You might think this should be possible. After all, you're conscious, and then you're unconscious, so surely you can observe the transition. But you can't. The moment you're truly falling asleep, there's no you there to observe it. The observer itself is what's dissolving. This brings us to an even more perplexing aspect of the paradox. If your consciousness requires an observer, but that observer requires another observer to be conscious of itself, and so on, infinitely, how is consciousness possible at all? It's like trying to build a skyscraper that requires an infinite number of floors before you can lay the first foundation. Yet, here you are, conscious and aware, reading these words and thinking about thinking. Your consciousness clearly exists, but when we try to pin down exactly how it works, we end up in these paradoxical loops. It's as if consciousness is a magic trick that works perfectly until you try to figure out how it's done. The implications of this paradox extend far beyond mere philosophical curiosity. Consider artificial intelligence, for instance. If we can't even understand how our own consciousness works, how can we hope to create truly conscious machines? Would an AI need to be capable of this infinite regression to be truly self-aware? Or is this paradox actually pointing to a fundamental flaw in how we think about consciousness? Some researchers in cognitive science suggest that this paradox might be telling us something important about the structure of consciousness itself. Perhaps consciousness isn't actually linear, with one thought following another in a neat chain. Maybe it's more like a network, with thoughts and awareness emerging from the complex interactions of countless mental processes, none of which is the ultimate observer. This network theory might explain why we can't find the final observer, because there isn't one. Consciousness might be more like a city than a person. A city emerges from the interactions of its millions of residents, but you can't point to any single person or building and say, that's the city. Similarly, your consciousness might emerge from the interactions of countless mental processes, none of which is you, but all of which together create your sense of self. As we let this paradox sink in, you might notice something happening to your own awareness. Maybe you're becoming more conscious of your consciousness, creating new layers of observation even as you read about them. This heightened awareness can be both fascinating and unsettling. It's like becoming aware of your own blinking or breathing, but at a much deeper, more fundamental level. This paradox serves as a perfect bridge to our next topic, where we'll explore how these infinite regressions of consciousness might relate to the nature of reality itself. But before we move on, take a moment to notice who's doing the noticing of your noticing of this moment. And remember, the confusion you're feeling isn't a sign that you're not getting it. The confusion is the point. These paradoxes reveal the limits of our normal ways of thinking, and pushing against those limits is how we expand our understanding. As we peel back the layers of consciousness and reality, let's confront perhaps the most unsettling paradox of all, the simulation recursion paradox. This mind-bending concept begins with a simple question that quickly unravels everything we think we know about existence itself. Imagine you're a brilliant programmer in the year 2089, and you've created the most advanced simulation of the universe ever devised. Your simulation is so perfect that the artificial beings within it have developed their own consciousness, their own civilizations, and, here's where it gets interesting, their own ability to create simulations. Now, these simulated beings, not knowing they're in a simulation, have created their own universe simulation. And within that simulation, another civilization has evolved and created yet another simulation. And so on, creating an infinite cascade of simulated realities, each nested inside the other, like an endless series of Russian dolls. Here's where the paradox hits you like a quantum sledgehammer. How do you know you're not already in one of these simulated universes? In fact, given the infinite regression of simulations, the probability that you're in the base reality, the original, non-simulated universe, is mathematically approaching zero. Preparing and narrating this theory took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the theory. But wait, it gets even more mind-bending. If you are in a simulation, the beings running your simulation must also face the same question about their own reality. And the beings simulating them must do the same. Every level of reality must confront the possibility that they're not the real ones. Consider this. If you were to create a perfect simulation of our universe, it would need to simulate every particle, every wave function, every quantum interaction. But to be truly perfect, it would also need to simulate the computer running the simulation itself, since that computer exists within the universe being simulated. This creates an impossible recursive loop, a simulation that must simulate itself, simulating itself, simulating itself. This recursive requirement raises profound questions about the nature of computation and reality. If each simulation requires more computational power than the level above it, since it must simulate everything, including the computer running it, we quickly reach an impossible situation. It's like trying to draw a map that includes itself. Each time you draw the map within the map, it needs to be even more detailed than the previous one. Some philosophers argue that this paradox actually proves we must be in base reality, the original, non-simulated universe. Their reasoning is that since an infinite regression of increasingly complex simulations is impossible, the whole chain must start somewhere. But this argument has a fatal flaw. Even if infinite regression is impossible, that doesn't tell us which level we're on. We could still be on simulation, level 156,742, completely unaware of our simulated nature. The implications of this paradox become even more fascinating when we consider consciousness. If we are in a simulation, is our consciousness real? But then, what does real even mean in this context? If our thoughts and feelings are the result of simulated neural patterns, are they any less meaningful than thoughts arising from non-simulated neurons? This leads us to a startling possibility. Perhaps the distinction between real and simulated is itself an illusion. After all, what makes the base reality any more real than a simulation? Both are systems operating according to consistent rules, generating experiences and consciousness. The only difference is the substrate they run on. And who's to say which substrate is more authentic? Take a moment to really let that sink in. Every decision you've ever made, every emotion you've ever felt, every memory you cherish, they could all be lines of code in an unimaginably complex program. But here's the beautiful twist. Even if they are, does that make them any less meaningful to you, the experiencing consciousness? As you ponder this, you might notice your reality seeming less solid, more fluid. The walls around you, the device you're using to engage with these words, even your own thoughts, they could all be exquisitely rendered elements of a simulation. And yet, paradoxically, understanding this doesn't make them any less real. If anything, it makes reality more wondrous, more mysterious. This paradox forces us to confront the nature of reality itself. If we can't determine whether we're in a simulation, and if being in a simulation wouldn't fundamentally change the meaning or validity of our experiences, then perhaps the question itself is irrelevant. Maybe the true nature of reality isn't about whether it's real or simulated, but about the consciousness experiencing it. As we prepare to dive into our next paradox, carry this thought with you. Every attempt to prove you're not in a simulation would have to rely on rules that could themselves be part of the simulation. It's a perfect trap, a logical Mobius strip that loops back on itself infinitely. And yet here you are, thinking about it, experiencing it, existing within whatever level of reality you happen to occupy. Having explored the dizzying depths of simulated realities, let's turn our attention to a paradox that challenges our most basic understanding of knowledge itself, the omniscience impossibility paradox. This paradox doesn't just question what we know, it questions whether complete knowledge is even possible. Imagine for a moment that you possessed absolute knowledge of everything in the universe. Every particle, every wave function, every thought in every mind, every possible future, and every detail of the past. You are, in this thought experiment, omniscient. But here's where the paradox begins to unravel your mind. Would you know everything about your own knowledge? Let's break this down step by step. If you're truly omniscient, you must know everything about your own mind, including all the knowledge it contains. But to know everything about your knowledge, you need to know about your knowledge of your knowledge. And then you need to know about your knowledge of your knowledge of your knowledge. Just like our earlier infinity mirrors, we've created an endless recursion. But this paradox goes even deeper. Consider this. If you're omniscient, you must know every fact about the future. This means you know every decision you will ever make before you make it. But if you know with absolute certainty what decision you'll make, do you really have the freedom to make a different choice? And if you don't have that freedom, are you really making decisions at all? This creates a fascinating contradiction. An omniscient being would know their own future actions with perfect certainty, but this very knowledge would seem to eliminate their ability to choose those actions freely. It's like watching a movie you've seen before. You know exactly what's going to happen, but that knowledge makes you a passive observer rather than an active participant. The implications become even more mind-bending when we consider the nature of knowledge itself. To truly know something, you must be able to verify that your knowledge is correct. But how can an omniscient being verify their own omniscience? They would need some external reference point to check their knowledge against. But if they're truly omniscient, there can't be anything outside their knowledge to verify it against. Think about it this way. Imagine trying to create a complete catalog of every book in a library. To be truly complete, the catalog itself would need to be listed in the catalog, since it's also a book in the library. But then this new, longer catalog would also need to be listed, creating a new catalog, which would need to be listed, and so on, infinitely. The same problem applies to omniscience. Any complete knowledge of everything must include knowledge of itself, creating an infinite loop. This paradox has profound implications for artificial intelligence and the limits of knowledge. Many people dream of creating an AI that knows everything. But the omniscience impossibility paradox suggests that complete knowledge might be logically impossible. There might always be blind spots, areas where knowledge breaks down into paradox and contradiction. But here's where things get truly fascinating. What if these impossible loops and contradictions aren't bugs in the system of knowledge, but features? What if the impossibility of complete knowledge is actually what makes consciousness and free will possible? Perhaps it's precisely because we can't know everything about our own minds that we're able to make genuine choices and have authentic experiences. Consider your own consciousness right now. You're aware of your thoughts, but you can't predict with absolute certainty what you'll think next. This uncertainty, this gap in your knowledge of yourself, might be exactly what allows for creativity, spontaneity, and genuine choice. If you knew everything about your own mind, including all your future thoughts and decisions, would you really be thinking and deciding at all? This brings us to a beautiful irony. Perhaps the greatest wisdom is understanding the impossibility of complete knowledge. By recognizing the inherent limitations and paradoxes in our quest for understanding, we might actually come closer to genuine insight than we would by pursuing impossible complete knowledge. As you sit with this paradox, you might notice a strange sensation. The very act of thinking about the impossibility of complete knowledge is itself a form of knowledge. You're gaining understanding by contemplating the limits of understanding. It's like climbing a mountain only to discover that the summit is understanding why the summit can never be reached. This paradox serves as a humbling reminder of the limits of human knowledge and the endless mystery of existence. Yet rather than being discouraging, these limits can be seen as liberating. They remind us that there will always be more to discover, more to question, and more to wonder about. As we transition to our next paradox, keep this thought in mind. Perhaps true wisdom isn't about accumulating more and more knowledge, but about understanding the beautiful impossibility of knowing everything. Sometimes, the most profound insights come not from what we know, but from understanding what we cannot know. Now that we've explored the impossibility of complete knowledge, let's dive into a paradox that challenges our understanding of memory and personal identity. The Theseus memory paradox. Imagine your consciousness as a ship sailing through time, with your memories as the planks that make up its structure. But here's the twist. Every time you remember something, you're not actually accessing the original memory. Instead, you're creating a new version, slightly different from the last time you remembered it. Scientists have discovered that each time we recall a memory, we essentially reconstruct it. During this process, the memory becomes temporarily unstable and can be influenced by our current thoughts, emotions, and understanding. When the memory is restored, these new elements become part of it. It's like taking a photograph of a photograph. Each copy loses some detail and gains some distortion. But here's where the paradox begins to unravel our sense of self. If every memory is actually a reconstruction, and each reconstruction slightly alters the memory, then after enough time passes, is it still the same memory at all? Just like the ancient paradox of Theseus's ship, where every plank is gradually replaced until none of the original material remains, our memories undergo a similar transformation. Consider your earliest childhood memory. Perhaps it's a birthday party, or playing in a park, or the face of a loved one. You might think you're accessing the original experience, but you're actually remembering the last time you remembered it. And that version was remembering the time before that, and so on, creating a chain of increasingly distant reconstructions stretching back to the original event. This raises a profound question about personal identity. If our memories make us who we are, but Our memories are constantly being reconstructed and altered. Are we still the same person we were yesterday? A month ago? A year ago? Like Theseus's ship, we might maintain the same shape and function, but the constituent parts, our memories, have been entirely replaced. The implications become even more mind-bending when we consider false memories. Studies have shown that it's remarkably easy to implant false memories in people's minds, and these artificial memories are experienced just as vividly as real ones. In fact, many of your own memories might be partially or entirely false, constructed from stories you've heard, photos you've seen, or experiences you've imagined. Think about a significant event from your past, perhaps your first day of school or a memorable vacation. How much of what you remember is the actual event, and how much is a narrative you've constructed from photos, stories, and subsequent experiences? The more you think about it, the harder it becomes to distinguish between genuine memories and constructed ones. This leads us to an even more unsettling question. If our memories are constantly being reconstructed, and if some of them might be false, what does this mean for our sense of continuous identity? We tend to think of ourselves as a continuous stream of consciousness, maintaining a consistent identity over time. But if the memories that form the foundation of that identity are fluid and unreliable, what anchors our sense of self? The paradox deepens when we consider how memories influence future memories. Each time you recall an event, your current state of mind affects how you reconstruct that memory. This new version then becomes the basis for future reconstructions. It's like a game of telephone played across time, where each retelling subtly alters the message, but you're both the speaker and the listener. Perhaps most fascinating is how this paradox affects our present experience. Right now, as you're reading these words, you're not just processing new information. You're integrating it with your existing memories, which themselves are reconstructions. Your understanding of this paradox is being built upon memories that might have already been significantly altered from their original form. This creates a kind of cognitive vertigo, the realization that your past isn't a fixed sequence of events stored like files in a computer, but rather a dynamic, ever-changing landscape that's constantly being rewritten by the present. Your memories of reading this explanation will themselves be reconstructed differently each time you recall them, influenced by your future experiences and understanding. As we prepare to transition to our next paradox, consider this final thought. Perhaps the fluid, reconstructive nature of memory isn't a flaw in our cognitive system, but a feature. This flexibility allows us to learn, grow, and adapt our understanding of the past in light of new experiences. Your memories might not be perfect recordings of past events, but they're something perhaps more valuable. They're living, evolving stories that help you make sense of your journey through time. And speaking of time, our next paradox will challenge everything you think you know about cause and effect, building on this understanding of memory's fluid nature to explore an even more fundamental aspect of reality. Having explored how our memories reshape themselves through time, let's dive into an even more fundamental paradox that challenges our basic understanding of cause and effect, the predestination free will loop. This paradox doesn't just question how we make choices. It questions whether choice itself is an illusion created by our limited perspective of time. Imagine you receive a letter in the mail containing next week's lottery numbers. Intrigued, you play these numbers and win. A week later, you decide to send your past self the winning numbers. Stop here for a moment. Where did the information about the winning numbers originally come from? You only knew them because you received them from your future self, who only knew them because they received them from their future self, and so on in an endless loop. This creates what physicists call a causality loop, a sequence of events where each event is both the cause and effect of another event in the loop. The information about the winning numbers seems to emerge from nowhere, existing in a closed temporal circuit with no clear point of origin. But here's where it gets even more mind-bending. Extend this concept to every decision you've ever made. Every choice you make today influences who you'll become tomorrow. But who you are today was shaped by all your past decisions. So who's really making these choices? Is it the you of the present? Or was it all predetermined by the choices of your past self, who was in turn influenced by their future, your present self? Consider this practical experiment. Decide right now to raise your right hand. Simple enough, right? You made a conscious choice to move your hand. But what caused you to make that specific choice at this specific moment? Perhaps it was reading the suggestion in this text. But then, what caused you to read this text at this exact moment? And what caused the sequence of events that led to this text being written and you encountering it? Following this chain of causation backwards, we quickly realize that every decision we make is influenced by countless prior events, each of which was influenced by countless events before it. This web of causation extends back to the beginning of time itself. So when you raised your hand just now, was it really a free choice? Or was it the inevitable result of an unimaginably complex chain of cause and effect? This paradox becomes even more complex when we consider quantum mechanics. At the quantum level, events appear to be genuinely random, not determined by prior causes. Some philosophers and scientists suggest that this quantum indeterminacy might create room for free will. But here's the twist. Even if some events are truly random, does randomness equal choice? Is a decision more free if it's influenced by quantum randomness rather than classical causation? The implications of this paradox extend far beyond abstract philosophy. Consider the justice system, which is built on the assumption that people make free choices and can be held responsible for their actions. But if every decision is either the result of prior causes or quantum randomness, where does moral responsibility enter the picture? Can someone be truly responsible for a choice that was inevitably shaped by factors outside their control? This leads us to an even deeper question. What does it mean to make a choice at all? When you decide something, you presumably choose the option that appeals to you most. But you didn't choose what would appeal to you. That was determined by your preferences, which were shaped by your experiences, genetics, and circumstances, none of which you chose. It's like being free to choose your favorite color. You can pick any color you want, but you can't choose which color you'll prefer. Perhaps most disturbing is how this paradox affects our sense of self. We tend to think of ourselves as autonomous agents, making decisions and shaping our destinies. But if our choices are just links in an infinite chain of cause and effect, what happens to our identity as independent beings? Are we more like characters in a story, believing we're making choices while actually following a predetermined script. Yet there's a strange comfort hidden within this paradox. If every decision you make is influenced by the entire history of the universe leading up to that moment, then in a sense your choices are the universe expressing itself through you. Your decisions, while perhaps not free in the conventional sense, are the unique result of your particular position in the vast web of causality. As we prepare to explore our next paradox, consider this. Perhaps free will and determinism aren't opposites, but rather two perspectives on the same phenomenon, like viewing a Mobius strip from different angles. The very fact that you can contemplate this paradox, questioning the nature of your own choices, might itself be evidence of a deeper kind of freedom, not freedom from causation, but freedom through understanding. And speaking of understanding, our next paradox will challenge everything you think you know about knowledge itself, building on this question of whether our thoughts are truly our own. Now that we've questioned whether our choices are truly our own, let's explore a paradox that challenges the very nature of possibility itself, the quantum immortality paradox. This thought experiment takes the already mind-bending principles of quantum mechanics and applies them to the most personal question of all, our own mortality. Imagine you're conducting a thought experiment, first proposed by physicist Hugh Everett III. You're in a sealed room with a quantum-triggered device that has a 50-50 chance of ending your life instantly and painlessly each time it's activated. The trigger is connected to a quantum event, like the decay of a radioactive atom, making it truly random at the quantum level. You activate the device. According to quantum mechanics, the universe splits into two branches, one where you survive and one where you don't. But here's the crucial twist. You can only experience the branch where you survive. From your perspective, you will always find yourself alive, no matter how many times you activate the device. In the branches where you don't survive, there is no consciousness to experience that outcome. This leads to a disturbing conclusion. From your own subjective perspective, you cannot experience death. In every scenario where death would occur, your consciousness would continue along a path where you somehow survive. You would effectively be immortal from your own point of view, even though observers in any given branch of reality might see you die. Consider the implications of this paradox in everyday life. Every time you have a near-death experience, a car swerving just in time, a disease going into unexpected remission, a falling object missing you by inches, could these be moments where you died in countless other quantum branches? Are you constantly sliding along the razor's edge of probability, always experiencing only those vanishingly rare branches where you somehow survive? The paradox becomes even more complex when we consider aging. Even if quantum immortality prevents sudden death, what about the gradual decay of aging? Would consciousness always find a path where medical breakthroughs extend life? Would you experience an endless series of miraculous recoveries and revolutionary treatments, keeping you alive far beyond normal human lifespan? But here's where it gets truly mind-bending. If quantum immortality is real, it must have already been working throughout your entire life. Think about all the dangerous situations you've survived, all the close calls and near misses. In how many quantum branches did those incidents end differently? Are you already living in an incredibly improbable branch of reality, having survived countless potentially fatal events. This raises profound questions about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to quantum mechanics. If consciousness can only experience branches where it continues to exist, does this mean consciousness itself is somehow fundamental to the universe? Is the fact that you're experiencing this moment, right now, evidence that you're in one of the branches where your consciousness continues? The implications extend beyond individual survival. Consider the future of humanity itself. If quantum immortality applies to consciousness in general, does this mean that consciousness will always find a way to continue? In some branch of reality, does humanity always manage to survive every potential extinction event, every cosmic catastrophe, every possible end? This connects back to our earlier paradoxes about consciousness and free will. If you're constantly shifting into branches where you survive, are these shifts a form of choice? Is your consciousness somehow selecting these branches? Or is it merely experiencing the only branches it can possibly experience? And if you're always experiencing survival, what does this mean for the concept of risk and decision-making? Think about it this way. If you knew with certainty that you would subjectively experience survival, no matter what, how would this affect your behavior? Would you take more risks? Would you live differently? But here's another twist. Even if quantum immortality is real, you have no way of knowing which type of survival you'll experience. Perhaps surviving reckless behavior leads to branches of reality where survival comes at a terrible cost. The paradox also intersects with our earlier discussions about memory and identity. If you're constantly shifting through quantum branches, experiencing only those where you survive, what happens to your memories and sense of self? Are you accumulating experiences from an increasingly improbable series of survival events? Is your consciousness navigating through the multiverse, always finding a path forward, no matter how unlikely? As we prepare to delve into our next paradox, consider this. Right now, you're experiencing a branch of reality where you're alive and conscious enough to contemplate these ideas. According to the quantum immortality paradox, this may be one of countless branches where your consciousness continues, constantly surfing the quantum waves of possibility. Perhaps the very fact that you can consider this paradox is evidence of your consciousness's endless journey through the quantum maze of existence. And speaking of existence, our next paradox will challenge everything you think you know about the nature of reality itself, building on these quantum concepts to explore an even more fundamental mystery of the universe. Having explored the dizzying implications of quantum immortality, let's dive into what might be the most profound paradox of all, the observer creation paradox. This mind-bending concept suggests that the very act of observing the universe might be what brings it into existence, but with a twist that will make you question everything you think you know about reality. Imagine you're the only conscious observer in the universe, experiencing reality in this moment. You might assume that the world existed before you became conscious of it and will continue to exist after you cease observing it. But quantum mechanics tells us something far stranger. Without observation, quantum systems exist in a state of superposition, where all possibilities exist simultaneously. Here's where it gets weird. What if consciousness itself is what collapses these quantum possibilities into definite reality. This isn't just about small quantum particles. It's about the entire universe. According to this paradox, the past only exists because you're observing evidence of it in the present. The dinosaurs only existed because we find their fossils. The Big Bang only happened because we can detect its afterglow in cosmic radiation. Think about that for a moment. Every time you observe evidence of the past, you're potentially forcing that past into existence. But here's the mind-bending loop. You only exist because of that past, which only exists because you're observing it. It's like you're creating your own prehistory by observing its effects in the present. Consider your earliest childhood memory. You might think that memory represents a real event that happened in the past. But what if the act of remembering it is what makes that past real? What if your consciousness, existing in the present, is what gives reality to the chain of events that led to your existence? This creates a causality paradox, even more profound than our previous ones. You exist because of your parents, who existed because of their parents, who existed because of their parents. But all of this past only becomes real when you observe evidence of it in the present. You're essentially creating your own ancestry through the act of existing to observe it. The implications become even more staggering when we consider the future. If consciousness collapses quantum possibilities into reality, what happens to possibilities we never observe? Do they remain in a state of quantum superposition forever? Are there infinite potential futures existing simultaneously, waiting for consciousness to collapse them into reality? This connects back to our discussion of quantum immortality, but with an even more profound twist. What if consciousness doesn't just follow the branches where it survives, but actually creates those branches through the act of observation? What if your consciousness is constantly creating the reality it needs to continue existing? The paradox deepens when we consider multiple observers. If your consciousness creates reality through observation, and my consciousness creates reality through observation, whose reality is real? Are we each creating our own version of the universe? Do these versions interact, or are we each trapped in our own observer-created reality? This leads to an even more unsettling question. What happens to reality when you're not observing it? When you look away from something, does it continue to exist in a definite state, or does it dissolve back into a quantum soup of possibilities? The traditional answer is that other observers keep it real. But can you ever be certain that other observers exist when you're not observing them? Think about your room right now. You're observing part of it. But what about the parts behind you? Sure, you can turn around to look. But then, what happens to the parts you were originally looking at? You might argue that they continue to exist because you remember them. But remember our discussion about memory. Are you remembering what was there, or creating what must have been there to match your expectations? This paradox suggests something profound about the nature of reality. Perhaps it's not a fixed, objective thing that exists independently of consciousness. Maybe reality is more like a dance between consciousness and possibility, with each observer constantly creating and recreating their version of the universe through the act of observation. But here's the most mind-bending part. If consciousness creates reality through observation, and consciousness itself is part of reality, then consciousness must be creating itself. It's an infinite loop of self-creation. Consciousness observes reality, which creates the conditions for consciousness to exist, which allows consciousness to observe reality, and so on. As we prepare to explore our next paradox, consider this. Right now, you're observing these words, creating the reality where they exist, which in turn creates the reality where you exist to observe them. Your consciousness might not just be experiencing reality, it might be an essential part of what makes reality real. And speaking of what's real, our next paradox will challenge everything you think you know about existence itself, taking us even deeper into the rabbit hole of consciousness and reality. Now that we've questioned whether consciousness creates reality, let's explore an even more unsettling possibility: the inverse reality paradox. This paradox suggests that everything we think we know about reality might be exactly backward, and proving it wrong might actually prove it right. Imagine you're absolutely certain about something. Perhaps that you're reading these words right now. You can see them, process their meaning, and understand them. But here's where the paradox begins. What if the more convinced you are of something's reality, the less real it actually is? What if certainty itself is the greatest illusion? Consider this thought experiment. You're in a vivid dream, completely convinced that what you're experiencing is real. The moment you become certain it's a dream, you wake up to reality. But what if this pattern continues infinitely? What if every time you become certain you're in base reality, that very certainty triggers an awakening to an even more real reality? This creates a troubling correlation. The more real something seems, the more likely it is to be an illusion. Conversely, the things that seem most illusory might be closest to true reality. It's like a cosmic game of hot and cold, where the warmer you feel about your grasp of reality, the further you actually are from it. Think about your most fundamental beliefs about reality, gravity, time, cause, and effect. We're certain about these because we experience them consistently. But according to this paradox, that very consistency might be evidence of their illusory nature. The more predictable and understandable something is, the more likely it is to be a simplified model rather than fundamental truth. Let's make this more concrete. When you're in a dream, the dream world feels completely real until something breaks the illusion. Perhaps a physical impossibility or a logical contradiction. These glitches in the dream's reality actually point toward a greater truth, that you're dreaming. The very things that seem most unreal are what reveal the truth about your situation. This paradox becomes even more complex when we apply it to consciousness itself. We feel certain that we're conscious, aware beings experiencing reality. But what if this very certainty is the ultimate illusion? What if true reality is something so fundamentally different from our experience that our certainty about our own consciousness is actually evidence of how far we are from understanding it? Consider how this relates to scientific discovery. Throughout history, every time we've become certain about our understanding of the universe, we've discovered something that completely upends that understanding. Newtonian physics seemed absolutely certain until quantum mechanics revealed a deeper, stranger reality. What if this pattern continues infinitely? What if every final theory is just another layer of illusion? The paradox takes an even more twisted turn when we try to disprove it. If you could prove that reality isn't inverse to our certainty, that very proof would become something you're certain about, which, according to the paradox, would make it false. The very act of disproving the paradox would actually prove it right. This creates a sort of cognitive quicksand. The harder you try to grasp true reality, the more it slips away. Every time you think you've reached solid ground, that very thought becomes evidence that you're still in illusion. It's like trying to see your own eyes without using a reflection. The very mechanism you use to perceive prevents you from perceiving it. But here's where it gets really interesting. What if this impossibility of reaching certainty is itself the deepest truth? What if the most fundamental aspect of reality is that it cannot be fundamentally known? This would mean that the only way to get closer to truth is to embrace uncertainty, to hold all beliefs provisionally, to remain open to the possibility that everything we think we know is wrong. This connects back to our earlier paradoxes about consciousness and observation. If consciousness creates reality through observation, but certainty about that reality indicates illusion, then perhaps consciousness itself is a tool for navigating layers of illusion rather than perceiving truth. Maybe our entire experience of existence is a kind of necessary illusion that allows us to interact with something utterly beyond our comprehension. As you contemplate this paradox, you might notice something strange happening to your perception. The more you question what's real, the more real the questioning itself becomes. But according to the paradox, this growing certainty about uncertainty might itself be yet another layer of illusion. It's like a hall of mirrors where every reflection shows a different kind of emptiness. And speaking of emptiness, our next paradox will take us even deeper into the nature of existence and non-existence, exploring what might be the ultimate question. Why is there something rather than nothing? Having questioned the nature of reality itself, let's confront what philosophers call the primordial existence paradox, the mind-bending question of why there's something rather than nothing. But this isn't just about the origin of existence. It's about a deeper contradiction that lies at the heart of nothingness itself. Consider absolute nothingness, not empty space, not a vacuum, but the complete absence of everything, including space, time, and even the laws of physics. Try to imagine it. But here's where the paradox begins. The moment you try to imagine or define nothingness, you've already created something, the concept of nothingness itself. True nothingness can't even include the possibility of nothingness, because that possibility would be something. This creates an impossible contradiction. If absolute nothingness existed, it would be something, which means it wouldn't be nothingness. But if it doesn't exist, then something must always have existed, which means there was never true nothingness. Either way, we reach a logical impossibility. Perfect nothingness cannot exist because its very existence would make it something. Think about your own consciousness right now. You might try to imagine removing everything from existence, all matter, energy, space, and time. But your imagining itself is something. The very act of conceptualizing nothingness creates a perspective from which nothingness is observed, immediately negating true nothingness. This paradox becomes even more perplexing when we consider existence itself. If perfect nothingness is impossible because it would be something, does this mean that existence is necessary? that something must exist because even the absence of everything would be something? It's as if existence is a logical necessity, not because something had to create it, but because non-existence is self-contradictory. Consider the implications for the origin of the universe. Scientists often ask what existed before the Big Bang, but this paradox suggests a different question. Was true nothingness ever even possible? If not, then perhaps the universe didn't need to come from anything. Maybe existence itself is more fundamental than nothingness. This connects to quantum mechanics in a fascinating way. In quantum physics, true nothingness appears to be impossible. Even in a perfect vacuum, quantum fluctuations continuously create and destroy particles. It's as if nature itself reflects this paradox. Try to create perfect nothingness, and something will inevitably emerge from it. But here's where it gets even stranger. If existence is necessary because non-existence is impossible, what determines which things exist? Why this universe with these particular laws of physics? Why consciousness? The paradox suggests that existence itself is necessary, but doesn't explain the specific form that existence takes. Think about your own existence in this context. You might wonder why you exist, but this paradox suggests a different question. Was your non-existence ever truly possible? If perfect nothingness is impossible, then perhaps existence in some form was inevitable. Your specific form might be contingent, but existence itself might be necessary. This creates a peculiar kind of existential vertigo. You exist not because something caused you to exist, but because non-existence itself is impossible. It's not that you came from nothing. It's that nothing was never an option. Existence isn't something that needs to be explained. It's non-existence that turns out to be logically impossible. The paradox takes an even deeper turn when we consider consciousness. If existence is necessary because non-existence is self-contradictory, what does this mean for conscious experience? Perhaps consciousness isn't something that emerged within existence, but rather another manifestation of the necessity of existence itself, another expression of the impossibility of nothingness. As you sit with this paradox, you might notice how it affects your perception of reality. The world around you no longer seems like something that just happens to exist, but rather like something that couldn't not exist. Every object, every thought, every moment becomes a manifestation of existence's necessity, a testament to the impossibility of true nothingness. And speaking of existence, our next paradox will challenge everything you think you know about the nature of reality and consciousness, taking us even deeper into the mystery of being itself. Having explored why something exists rather than nothing, let's dive into what might be the most self-destructive paradox of all, the truth eater paradox. This mind-bending concept suggests that the deeper we dig for ultimate truth, the more we destroy the very possibility of finding it. Imagine truth as a vast landscape that you're exploring. With each discovery, each new understanding, you dig deeper into the nature of reality. But here's the paradox. Each truth you uncover doesn't just add to your knowledge. It actually destroys the possibility of certain other truths existing. It's as if the act of discovering truth creates zones of impossibility around that truth, like a cosmic game of Minesweeper, where revealing one square eliminates possibilities in all adjacent squares. Consider a simple example. You discover that light acts like a wave. This seems like pure gain. You've learned something true about reality. But then you discover that light also acts like a particle. Each of these truths, when taken alone, seems to contradict the other. The discovery of one truth appears to make the other truth impossible, yet both are demonstrably true. It's as if reality itself is playing a game of quantum hide-and-seek with us. This paradox becomes even more unsettling when we apply it to consciousness and perception. Every time you learn something new about how your brain processes information, you discover limitations and biases in your thinking. These discoveries are themselves truths, but they're truths that undermine your ability to trust your own understanding. It's like using a microscope to examine the microscope you're using. Each discovery about your tools of perception makes you question everything you've perceived. But here's where it gets really mind-bending. What if this destructive nature of truth discovery isn't a bug, but a feature? What if the ultimate truth about reality is that complete truth is impossible, precisely because discovering truth destroys other truths? It would be like trying to create a map that's perfectly accurate. The more detail you add, the larger the map becomes, until it would have to be as large as the territory it's mapping, at which point it ceases to be useful as a map. Think about your own search for understanding. Each time you learn something new that seems absolutely true, you often discover that it conflicts with or undermines something else you thought was true. It's not just that you were wrong before, it's that the new truth actively makes certain old truths impossible, forcing you to abandon or radically revise them. This connects back to quantum mechanics in a fascinating way. The more precisely you measure a particle's position, the less precisely you can know its momentum, and vice versa. It's not just a limitation of our measuring tools, it's a fundamental aspect of reality. The discovery of one truth literally destroys the possibility of simultaneously knowing another truth with perfect precision. Now extend this principle to all of reality. What if every fundamental truth we discover about the universe makes other truths impossible to discover? What if the act of learning literally changes what can be known? It would be like trying to complete a jigsaw puzzle where placing each piece correctly makes other pieces change shape. The implications become even more profound when we consider the nature of scientific progress. Each new scientific discovery doesn't just add to our knowledge, it often makes previous theories impossible to believe. But here's the twist. Those older theories weren't exactly wrong. They were true within their context. Newtonian physics isn't wrong. It's true within its domain. But discovering quantum mechanics made it impossible to believe in the absolute truth of Newtonian physics. This creates a kind of epistemological vertigo. The more we learn, the more we realize that absolute truth might be impossible, not because we can't find it, but because finding some truths actively destroys the possibility of others. It's like trying to illuminate a room that becomes darker in some places the more light you add. Consider this paradox in relation to your own beliefs right now. Every time you become absolutely certain about something, that very certainty might be destroying your ability to discover other truths. The most profound understanding might come not from accumulating truths, but from understanding how the discovery of truth creates zones of impossibility around it. As we prepare to explore our next paradox, consider this. What if the ultimate truth is that truth itself is paradoxical? What if the deepest understanding comes not from resolving paradoxes, but from embracing the way truth seems to eat itself? Perhaps the wisest stance isn't to seek absolute truth, but to dance with the way truths create and destroy each other in an endless cosmic ballet. And speaking of cosmic dances, our next paradox will challenge everything you think you know about time and causality, taking us even deeper into the mysterious nature of reality itself. Now that we've seen how truth can devour itself, let's explore what might be the most personally unsettling paradox of all, the identity dissolution paradox. This concept suggests that the very thing you think of as you might be an illusion created by your attempt to maintain a consistent sense of self through time. Imagine watching a candle flame. From moment to moment, you say it's the same flame, but is it really? The matter making up the flame is constantly changing. New molecules are being consumed, while others are dissipating into the air. Nothing physical about the flame remains constant, yet we insist on seeing it as a continuous entity. Now apply this same thinking to yourself. Every moment, your body is changing. Cells die and are replaced. Neurons fire in new patterns. Memories fade while new ones form. The atoms that made up you 5 years ago are almost entirely different from the atoms that make up you now. Even your thoughts, beliefs, and personality traits have shifted. So what exactly has remained constant enough to justify saying you're the same person? This isn't just about physical continuity. Consider your memories, the very thing you might think defines your continuous identity. But as we discussed earlier, memories are not perfect recordings. They're reconstructions that change slightly each time you recall them. The you that you remember being in the past is itself a present construction, constantly being rewritten by your current self. But here's where the paradox deepens. The very act of trying to maintain a consistent identity might be what prevents you from seeing your true nature. By insisting that you're the same person from moment to moment, you create a fictional narrative that blinds you to the reality of constant change. It's like trying to freeze a river by taking a photograph of it. The very act of capturing it transforms it into something it's not. Think about how this applies to your current experience. Right now, you're reading these words and thinking about identity. But who exactly is doing the reading and thinking? The you that started reading this paragraph is already gone, replaced by a slightly different configuration of thoughts and neural patterns. Yet you maintain the illusion that a single continuous you is following this discussion. This connects to quantum mechanics in a fascinating way. Just as a quantum particle doesn't have a definite position until it's measured, perhaps your self doesn't have a fixed identity until it's observed. The act of self-reflection might be creating the very thing it's trying to observe, like a quantum measurement, collapsing a wave function of possible selves into a single, illusory identity. Consider your decision-making process. When you make a choice, who exactly is making it? The you that started considering the choice is different from the you that finalizes the decision. Each moment of deliberation changes your neural patterns, your emotional state, your understanding of the situation. So which you is actually responsible for the choice? This paradox becomes even more profound when we consider personal growth and change. People often talk about finding themselves or becoming who they really are. But what if there's no fixed self to find? What if the search for authentic identity is itself what prevents us from experiencing our true nature as beings of constant change? Think about how you describe your past actions. I was young and foolish then, or I'm not that person anymore. These statements reveal the contradiction in our concept of identity. We simultaneously claim to be the same person throughout our lives, while also acknowledging that we're fundamentally different from our past selves. The implications extend beyond philosophy into practical reality. Legal systems, for instance, are based on the assumption of continuous personal identity. We hold people responsible for past actions based on the belief that they're the same person who committed those actions. But if identity is an illusion, what does this mean for concepts like responsibility and accountability? As you contemplate this paradox, you might notice something strange happening to your sense of self. The more you try to pin down exactly who you are, the more that certainty seems to slip away. It's like trying to catch your own reflection in a pool of water. The very act of reaching for it disturbs the surface and distorts the image. And speaking of distortions, our next paradox will challenge everything you think you know about perception and reality, taking us even deeper into the mystery of consciousness itself. But before we move on, consider this. The very fact that you can question your own identity might be the closest you can come to understanding your true nature, not as a fixed entity, but as the awareness in which all these changes occur. Having dissolved our notion of fixed identity, let's dive into what philosophers call the infinite perception paradox. This mind-bending concept suggests that every attempt to understand how we perceive reality creates another layer of perception that itself needs to be perceived, leading to an infinite regression that makes true understanding impossible. Start by considering how you're perceiving these words right now. Light hits the page or screen. Your eyes detect it. Your brain processes the signals, and you understand the meaning. Simple enough, right? But here's where the paradox begins. How do you know you're perceiving correctly? You'd need another level of perception to verify your initial perception. Think of it like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror. You can't directly observe your own observation. To verify your perception, you need another perspective. But then, how do you verify that perspective? You'd need yet another level of perception, and so on, infinitely. It's like trying to take a photograph of all cameras in existence. The camera taking the photo would always be left out of the picture. This paradox becomes even more fascinating when we apply it to consciousness itself. When you're conscious of something, there's the thing you're conscious of, and there's the consciousness of it. But then there's also your awareness of being conscious of it, and then there's your awareness of that awareness. Each level of consciousness seems to require another level to perceive it. Consider this practical example. You're feeling happy. You notice you're feeling happy. You notice that you've noticed you're feeling happy. You notice that you've noticed that you've noticed you're feeling happy. Each level of awareness creates a new layer that itself needs to be observed. It's like holding up two mirrors facing each other. The reflections go on forever. But here's where it gets truly mind-bending. This infinite regression isn't just a theoretical problem. It affects every attempt to understand our own consciousness. Any theory about how consciousness works must itself be perceived and understood by consciousness. It's like trying to use your eyes to understand how vision works. The very tool you're using to investigate is what you're trying to investigate. This connects back to our earlier paradoxes about truth and identity in a fascinating way. If every perception requires another perception to verify it, how can we ever be certain about anything? It's not just that we might be wrong. It's that the very attempt to confirm we're right creates new layers of uncertainty. Think about your most basic perceptions: colors, sounds, physical sensations. How do you know you're experiencing them correctly? You might say, well, other people experience them the same way. But how do you perceive that agreement? How do you verify your perception of other people's perceptions? Each attempt to ground your experience creates new experiences that themselves need grounding. The implications become even more profound when we consider scientific observation. Science relies on careful observation and measurement, but this paradox suggests that every observation creates new layers that themselves need to be observed. It's like trying to measure the length of a ruler with itself. There's always something left unmeasured. This paradox also raises fascinating questions about artificial intelligence and machine consciousness. If we created an AI that could perceive and think, how would it verify its own perceptions? Would it face the same infinite regression of consciousness that we do? Perhaps this paradox isn't just a limitation of human consciousness, but a fundamental aspect of any system that tries to understand itself. As you contemplate this paradox, you might notice something peculiar happening to your own awareness. Each attempt to grasp the paradox creates new layers of perception that themselves become part of what you're trying to understand. It's like trying to catch your own shadow. The faster you chase it, the faster it moves away. But here's a curious possibility. What if this infinite regression isn't a bug in consciousness, but a feature? What if the endless layers of perception are what create the rich, deep experience of being conscious? Perhaps consciousness isn't like a single spotlight illuminating reality, but rather like an infinite series of mirrors reflecting each other, creating depth through endless recursion. And speaking of endless recursion, our next paradox will take us even deeper into the nature of infinity itself, challenging everything you think you know about limits and boundlessness. But before we move on, take a moment to notice yourself noticing yourself, reading about noticing yourself. Each layer of awareness adds to the mystery of consciousness, making it both more puzzling and more profound. After exploring the infinite layers of perception, let's confront what mathematicians call the infinity division paradox. This concept doesn't just challenge our understanding of numbers, it reveals something profound about the nature of reality itself and the limits of human comprehension. Imagine you have an infinite line. Now cut it exactly in half. Each half is still infinitely long. Cut those halves in half again. You now have 4 infinite lines. Keep cutting, and no matter how many times you divide infinity, each piece remains infinite. But here's where your mind starts to melt. How can multiple infinities exist side by side? How can something be divided endlessly, while each division remains endless? Consider this practical example. Take all the whole numbers, 1, 2, 3, and all the even numbers, 2, 4, 6, 6 dots. The set of even numbers is clearly smaller since it's missing all the odd numbers. Yet both sets are infinite. Even more strange, you can pair each whole number with its double, showing that these two infinities are somehow the same size, despite one clearly containing only half the numbers of the other. This isn't just a mathematical curiosity. This paradox appears in the physical world in mind-bending ways. Consider Zeno's famous paradox about motion. Before you can walk across a room, you must first walk halfway. Before reaching that halfway point, you must reach the quarter-way point. Before that, the eighth, and so on, infinitely. Each journey contains an infinite number of smaller journeys, yet we somehow cross rooms all the time. But here's where it gets truly bizarre. Apply this thinking to time itself. Between any two moments, there are infinite possible moments. Between those moments, infinite more moments exist. It's like time is made up of an infinite stack of infinities, each one nestled inside the other, like some cosmic Russian doll that never ends. This connects back to consciousness in a fascinating way. Each moment of awareness contains infinite possible states of consciousness. Each of those states contains infinite possible variations. Your current experience right now, reading these words, contains within it infinite layers of awareness, each one infinitely divisible into more states of consciousness. Think about your own thoughts right now. Between any two thoughts, there could be another thought. Between those thoughts, more thoughts could exist. The space between your thoughts is itself infinite. Yet somehow your mind navigates this infinity of infinities every moment of every day. The paradox becomes even more profound when we consider digital information. Between any two numbers in a computer's binary code, you could theoretically insert infinite more numbers. Yet computers manage to process discrete information effectively. It's as if reality has found a way to bridge the gap between infinite possibility and practical finite implementation. This raises a fascinating question about the nature of reality itself. If space, time, and consciousness are all infinitely divisible, how does anything ever get from one point to another? How does change occur? How does thought progress? It's as if reality itself is built on a foundation of impossible infinities that somehow work together to create our experience of finite, concrete existence. Consider the implications for free will and decision-making. Between any two choices, there are infinite possible alternatives. Between those alternatives, infinite more possibilities exist. Every decision you make involves navigating through an infinity of infinities, yet somehow you manage to choose. It's like your consciousness has found a way to surf these waves of infinity without drowning in them. But here's where the paradox takes an even stranger turn. What if these infinite divisions aren't just a property of mathematics or philosophy, but a fundamental aspect of existence itself? What if reality is built not on solid, indivisible particles, but on endless layers of divisibility? This would mean that everything you think of as real is actually an infinite regression of smaller and smaller components, none of which are truly fundamental. As you contemplate this paradox, you might notice something peculiar happening to your perception of reality. The solid objects around you, the continuous flow of time, even your own stream of consciousness, all of these start to seem like convenient illusions, masking an underlying infinity of infinities. It's as if reality itself is a practical compromise between the finite world we experience and the infinite possibilities that underlie it. And speaking of possibilities, our next paradox will challenge everything you think you know about potential and actuality. taking us even deeper into the mystery of existence itself. But before we move on, take a moment to consider that between this thought and your next thought lies an infinity of possible thoughts, each containing its own infinity of variations, all somehow woven together into the seamless experience of consciousness. Having explored the dizzying nature of infinite division, let's confront what philosophers call the potential actualization paradox. This mind-bending concept suggests that the very act of realizing a possibility destroys all other possibilities, yet these destroyed possibilities must somehow exist to make any possibility possible at all. Imagine every possible version of this moment, infinite variations where you're reading slightly different words or doing something entirely different or not existing at all. According to quantum mechanics, all these possibilities exist simultaneously in a state of superposition until something forces reality to choose one particular outcome. But here's where the paradox begins. The moment one possibility becomes actual, all other possibilities must become impossible, because reality can't be two different ways at once. Think about a decision you're about to make, perhaps what to do after reading this. Before you decide, all possibilities exist simultaneously in your mind. But the moment you choose one action, all other possibilities vanish. They become roads not taken, theoretical branches that can never be actualized because you've already actualized a different possibility. But here's where it gets truly mind-bending. How can possibilities exist at all if they're never actualized? If only one version of reality can exist at any moment, what gives other possibilities their potential existence? It's like trying to imagine a library of books that were never written. The very act of imagining them brings them into a kind of existence, yet they remain forever unreal. Consider this practical example. You're about to snap your fingers. Before you do, there's a possibility you'll snap them now, or in 1 second, or in 2 seconds, or never at all. These possibilities seem to exist simultaneously. But the moment you actually snap your fingers, all other possible moments of finger snapping become impossible. They can never be actualized because that moment has passed and reality has already taken a different path. This connects back to quantum mechanics in a fascinating way. When scientists observe quantum particles, they find that unobserved particles exist in multiple states simultaneously. But the moment we observe them, they collapse into one definite state. It's as if the act of observation itself destroys all other possible states. Yet these states must have existed in some form to make the observation possible at all. The paradox becomes even more profound when we consider consciousness. Your current stream of consciousness seems to flow from one moment to the next, but each moment could have contained different thoughts, different awareness. When you think one thought, all other possible thoughts you could have had at that moment become impossible. Yet they must exist as possibilities to make any thought possible. Think about your memories, not just what you remember, but all the possible memories you could have had if events had been slightly different. These alternative memories seem to exist in some form as possibilities, yet they can never be actual memories because reality took a different path. But without these possible but never actual memories, how could any memories exist at all? This raises a fascinating question about the nature of reality itself. If every actualization destroys infinite possibilities, Yet these possibilities must exist for anything to be possible. Where do these possibilities exist? It's like reality needs a shadow realm of unactualized possibilities to make any actuality possible. Yet this realm can never truly exist because only one reality can be actual. The implications become even more staggering when we consider the future. Every possible future seems to exist simultaneously as potential, yet only one can become actual. But the moment one future becomes present, all other possibilities vanish. It's as if reality is constantly destroying infinite possible futures to create one actual present, yet needs these possible futures to have any future at all. As you contemplate this paradox, you might notice something strange happening to your perception of the present moment. Every actualized instant seems to rise from and destroy an ocean of possibilities. Yet these possibilities must somehow exist to make the present possible. It's like reality is constantly committing an infinite suicide of possibility to birth each moment of actuality. But here's perhaps the most mind-bending aspect. Your awareness of this paradox right now is itself an actualization that has destroyed all other possible awarenesses you could have had at this moment. Yet without those possible but never actual awarenesses, how could any awareness be possible at all? And speaking of awareness, our next paradox will challenge everything you think you know about consciousness and reality, taking us even deeper into the mystery of existence itself. But before we move on, consider that this very moment of understanding has emerged from and destroyed infinite other possible moments of understanding, yet needed those possibilities to become actual at all. Having explored how possibilities collapse into actuality, let's dive into what philosophers call the experience absorption paradox. This concept suggests that the deeper we examine any experience, the more it dissolves into an infinity of smaller experiences, none of which seem to contain the original experience we were trying to understand. Imagine you're experiencing the taste of an apple. Simple enough, right? But try to focus on exactly what that experience consists of. There's the sweetness, the tartness, the texture, the temperature, but each of these aspects can be broken down further. The sweetness itself has multiple dimensions. The texture contains countless sensations, and even the temperature isn't uniform throughout your mouth. But here's where the paradox begins. As you break down the experience into its components, the original unified experience of tasting an apple seems to disappear. It's like trying to understand what makes a painting beautiful by analyzing individual brushstrokes. The closer you look, the more the overall image dissolves into meaningless details. Think about your current experience of reading these words. What exactly is this experience made of? There's the visual perception of the text, the mental processing of meaning, the emotional response to the ideas, the physical sensations of your body. But each of these can be divided further. The visual perception contains countless points of light and shadow. The mental processing involves multiple layers of understanding. The emotional response combines various subtle feelings. This connects to quantum mechanics in a fascinating way. Just as observing a quantum particle forces it to collapse from a wave of possibilities into a specific state, trying to observe an experience seems to collapse it from a unified whole into a collection of separate components. But here's the twist. Just as no collection of specific particle positions can fully describe a quantum wave, no collection of component experiences seems to fully capture the original, unified experience. Consider your emotional experiences. When you feel happiness, for example, what exactly are you feeling? Try to examine the happiness closely, and it breaks down into various physical sensations, thoughts, memories, and smaller emotional notes. But none of these components, even when combined, seems to contain the simple, unified experience of being happy that you started with. The paradox becomes even more profound when we consider consciousness itself. What is the experience of being conscious? The moment you try to examine it, it splits into countless smaller experiences, thoughts, sensations, emotions, perceptions. But where in all these components is the original, simple experience of just being conscious? Think about how this applies to time. Your experience of this moment seems unified, but try to examine exactly what this moment consists of. It breaks down into smaller and smaller temporal slices, each containing its own complex mix of experiences. Yet, none of these slices seems to contain the flowing, unified experience of time that we normally take for granted. This raises a fascinating question about the nature of experience itself. If every experience dissolves into smaller experiences when examined closely, what are experiences actually made of? It's like trying to find the smallest unit of consciousness. Every time you think you found it, it can be divided further into even smaller experiences. But here's where it gets truly mind-bending. This paradox applies to itself. Try to examine your experience of understanding this paradox. That experience immediately breaks down into multiple components: the intellectual grasp of the concept, the emotional response to it, the physical sensations accompanying your thought process. Yet none of these components seems to contain the original experience of understanding. As you sit with this paradox, you might notice something strange happening to your awareness. Every experience you try to focus on seems to dissolve into an infinity of smaller experiences, none of which capture the original experience you were trying to understand. It's like trying to catch water with a net. The closer you look, the more it slips through your fingers. This creates a peculiar kind of cognitive vertigo. The more carefully you try to examine any experience, the more it seems to dissolve into something else. It's as if experiences can only exist when we're not looking too closely at them, like quantum states that collapse when observed, or dreams that dissolve when we try to remember them too precisely. And speaking of dreams, our next paradox will challenge everything you think you know about consciousness and reality, taking us even deeper into the mystery of experience itself. But before we move on, notice how your attempt to understand this paradox has itself become an experience that dissolves the moment you try to examine it too closely. Having witnessed how experiences dissolve under examination, let's explore what philosophers call the dream-reality recursion paradox. This concept suggests that our attempts to distinguish dreams from reality create an infinite loop that makes the distinction itself impossible to establish with certainty. Picture yourself waking up from a vivid dream. You're certain you're now awake and that what came before was just a dream. But here's where the paradox begins. How do you know you're actually awake? You might say, well, this feels more real. But in dreams, doesn't everything feel completely real until you wake up? Every time you've dreamed, you were convinced of its reality until the moment of waking. Consider this. How many times have you had a dream where you thought you woke up, only to later wake up for real and realize the previous waking was itself part of the dream? These false awakening experiences suggest that our certainty about being awake is no guarantee of actually being awake. After all, in dreams, we can be absolutely certain we're awake, only to discover we were wrong. But here's where it gets truly mind-bending. What if right now, as you're reading this, you're actually in a dream? You might think, no, this is definitely real. But that's exactly what you would think in a dream. You might say, I can prove this is real by testing it, pinching yourself, checking the time, looking for dreamlike inconsistencies. But couldn't all of these tests themselves be part of the dream? This creates an impossible recursive loop. Any method you devise to determine whether you're dreaming could itself be a dream. It's like trying to use a ruler to measure its own length. The very tool you're using to make the measurement is part of what you're trying to measure. Think about your most reliable method for distinguishing dreams from reality. Perhaps it's the consistency of physical laws, the coherence of events, the clarity of perception. But in dreams, couldn't these very methods appear to work perfectly? Couldn't you dream of a world with perfectly consistent physics, completely coherent events, and crystal clear perception? The paradox deepens when we consider memory. You might think, I know I'm awake because I remember going to sleep last night and then waking up this morning. But couldn't this entire sequence of memories be part of the dream? Just as dreams can include false memories of going to sleep and waking up, your current memory of waking up could be a dream-generated memory. Consider this practical experiment. Try to prove right now that you're not dreaming. Every piece of evidence you gather could be dream evidence. Every logical argument you construct could be dream logic. Every sensation you experience could be a dream sensation. It's like trying to step outside of a room while remaining inside it. The very act of attempting to verify reality could be part of the dream you're trying to verify. This connects back to our earlier paradoxes about consciousness and perception in a fascinating way. Just as the attempt to examine any experience causes it to dissolve into smaller experiences, the attempt to verify reality might dissolve our certainty about what's real. It's as if the harder we try to grab onto reality, the more it slips through our fingers. But here's where it gets even stranger. What if the distinction between dreams and reality isn't as clear-cut as we assume? What if consciousness exists on a spectrum with what we call reality and what we call dreams, being different points on that spectrum? Perhaps every moment contains both dreamlike and reality-like aspects, making any absolute distinction impossible. As you contemplate this paradox, you might notice something peculiar happening to your perception. The solid certainty of being awake begins to feel less solid. The clear boundary between dreaming and waking starts to blur. It's like becoming aware of being in a dream while still dreaming, a state of lucidity that questions its own lucidity. This paradox raises profound questions about the nature of consciousness itself. If we can't definitively distinguish dreams from reality, what does this mean for our understanding of consciousness? Are we conscious in the same way when dreaming as when awake? Is there even a meaningful difference between dream consciousness and waking consciousness? And speaking of consciousness, are Next paradox will challenge everything you think you know about awareness and existence, taking us even deeper into the mystery of being itself. But before we move on, consider this. The very uncertainty about whether you're dreaming right now might be the most real thing about your current experience. Having questioned the boundary between dreams and reality, let's delve into what philosophers call the memory creation paradox. This concept suggests that the very act of remembering something fundamentally alters or even creates the past we think we're remembering, making it impossible to ever access a true original memory. Imagine trying to remember your earliest childhood memory. You might see fragments of a scene, feel echoes of emotions, hear distant sounds. But here's where the paradox begins. Every time you recall this memory, you're not accessing the original experience. You're creating a new memory of remembering the memory. It's like making a copy of a copy of a copy, where each version introduces subtle changes that accumulate over time. Think about a significant event from your past, perhaps your first day of school or an important celebration. You might believe you're remembering exactly what happened, but research shows that each time we recall something, we reconstruct it based on our current knowledge, beliefs, and emotional state. The memory you're experiencing right now isn't the original event. It's a present moment construction, influenced by every time you've remembered it before. But here's where it gets truly mind-bending. If every act of remembering changes the memory, and we can only access our past through memories, how can we ever know what actually happened? It's like trying to preserve a snowflake. The very act of examining it causes it to melt and transform. Each attempt to access the past inevitably alters it. Consider this practical experiment. Try to remember what you had for breakfast 3 days ago. Any memory that comes to mind isn't the actual experience of eating breakfast. It's a reconstruction created by your current brain based on fragments of stored information. But in the process of remembering, you're creating a new memory that will influence how you remember that breakfast in the future. This connects to quantum mechanics in a fascinating way. Just as observing a quantum particle changes its state, observing a memory changes its content. It's as if memories exist in a superposition of possible states until the act of remembering collapses them into one specific version. But this version isn't necessarily what originally happened. The paradox becomes even more profound when we consider how this affects our sense of self. If our memories are constantly being rewritten every time we access them, what does this mean for our personal identity? We tend to think of ourselves as continuous beings with a coherent life story. But what if this story is being constantly rewritten each time we remember it? Think about your life story, the narrative you tell yourself about who you are and how you became this person. Every time you recall this narrative, you're not just remembering it, you're recreating it, potentially changing subtle details that will affect how you remember it next time. It's like being both the author and reader of your autobiography, where each reading results in a slightly different story. But here's where it gets even stranger. What if our memories aren't just passive recordings that get degraded over time, but active constructions that serve our current needs? Research suggests that we tend to remember things in ways that support our current self-image and beliefs. The past we remember might be less about what actually happened and more about what we need to believe happened to maintain our current sense of self. This raises fascinating questions about the nature of truth and history. If personal memories are constantly being rewritten, what about collective memories? Historical records might seem more reliable than individual memories, but they too are interpreted through the lens of present understanding and needs. It's as if the past itself is not a fixed reality, but a malleable construction that changes based on how and when we observe it. As you contemplate this paradox, you might notice something peculiar happening to your own memories. The more you try to pin down exactly what happened in your past, the more you realize that the very act of trying to remember is changing what you're trying to remember. It's like trying to catch a reflection in moving water. The attempt to grasp it disturbs the surface and transforms the image. And speaking of transformations, our next paradox will challenge everything you think you know about change and continuity, taking us even deeper into the mystery of existence itself. But before we move on, consider this. The memory of reading about this paradox is already being created and modified in your mind, becoming part of the ever-changing story of who you think you are. Having explored how memories transform through remembering, let's dive into what philosophers call the transformation identity paradox. This concept suggests that any attempt to identify the exact moment of change creates an infinite regression of smaller and smaller moments, making true change simultaneously inevitable and impossible. Imagine watching an ice cube melt. At what precise moment does it change from solid to liquid? You might try to identify that moment, but any instant you choose could be divided into before and after. If you zoom in on that division, you'll find another moment of transition that itself can be divided. It's like trying to find the exact point where night becomes day. The closer you look, the more the boundary dissolves into countless incremental changes. But here's where the paradox deepens. If we can't identify the exact moment of change, how can we be certain that change occurs at all? Yet we know things do change. We experience transformation constantly. This creates an impossible situation where change must both exist and be impossible to pinpoint in any given moment. Consider your own aging process. At what precise moment did you become an adult? When exactly did you transition from child to teenager, or from teenager to adult? Any boundary you try to draw can be questioned and subdivided. It's like trying to catch the exact moment you fall asleep. The harder you try to identify it, the more it eludes you. This connects to quantum mechanics in a fascinating way. Just as quantum particles exist in superpositions until observed, perhaps states of being exist in superposition until we try to measure or identify them. The very act of trying to pinpoint change might be what forces reality to choose one state or another, while the actual process of change remains forever elusive. Think about your own consciousness right now. Are you exactly the same person you were a moment ago? If not, at what precise instant did you change? If you are the same, how is continuous identity possible in a universe of constant transformation? It's like trying to step into the same river twice. Not only is the river different each time, but you yourself are different as well. The paradox becomes even more profound when we consider decision-making. At what exact moment does a thought become a decision? When precisely does intention transform into action? Any point you choose can be subdivided into smaller moments, each containing its own microscopic transitions. It's as if change is both happening constantly and never happening at all. But here's where it gets truly mind-bending. Apply this paradox to time itself. If we can't identify the exact moment of any change, what does this mean for our understanding of time? Is time a continuous flow, or is it made up of discrete moments? If continuous, how can we ever identify when anything happens? If discrete, how do we account for the transitions between moments? Consider this practical experiment. Try to catch yourself in the act of changing your mind about something. The moment you think you've identified the change, you'll find that the transformation was already underway before you noticed it. It's like trying to watch yourself fall asleep. The very act of watching prevents you from catching the exact moment of transition. This raises fascinating questions about the nature of identity and continuity. If we can't identify exact moments of change, how can we be sure we're the same person from moment to moment? Perhaps identity itself is a kind of necessary illusion, a way of creating continuity in a reality of constant, ungraspable transformation. As you contemplate this paradox, you might notice something peculiar happening to your perception of the present moment. The solid ground of now begins to feel less solid. Every attempt to grasp the present reveals it as a constantly shifting landscape of incomplete transformations. It's like trying to freeze a wave. The very act of stopping it destroys what makes it a wave. And speaking of waves, our next paradox will challenge everything you think you know about continuity and discreteness, taking us even deeper into the mystery of existence itself. But before we move on, notice how your understanding of this paradox is itself transforming, even as you try to pin down exactly when and how that transformation is occurring. Having explored the elusive nature of change, let's dive into what physicists call the wave-particle unity paradox. This concept suggests that reality itself might be neither continuous nor discrete, but rather something that transcends and includes both possibilities in a way our minds struggle to comprehend. Imagine watching ocean waves roll toward the shore. From a distance, they appear as smooth, continuous undulations of water, but zoom in close enough, and you'll find individual water molecules bouncing around discreetly. Zoom in even further, and these molecules dissolve into atoms, which dissolve into subatomic particles, which themselves seem to exist as probability waves until observed. But here's where the paradox begins. Which view is real, the continuous wave or the discrete particles? Quantum physics tells us that light and matter can behave as both waves and particles, depending on how we observe them. But this isn't just about physics. It's about the fundamental nature of reality itself. How can something be both continuous and discrete at the same time? It's like saying a number is both even and odd simultaneously, or that a door is both open and closed at once. Consider your own consciousness right now. Does your stream of awareness flow continuously, or is it made up of discrete moments of experience? Try to observe your own thoughts. Do they flow smoothly from one to the next, or do they come in distinct packets? The closer you look, the harder it becomes to tell. It's as if consciousness itself exhibits this same wave-particle duality. But here's where it gets truly mind-bending. What if this paradox isn't just about waves and particles, but about the very nature of observation itself? When we try to determine if something is continuous or discrete, we have to observe it in some way. But the act of observation might be forcing reality to appear in one form or the other, while its true nature remains both and neither. Think about music. When you hear a melody, it seems to flow continuously through time. But break it down, and you find discrete notes. Break those notes down further, and you find sound waves. Break those down, and you're back to particles of air vibrating. Each level of observation reveals a different aspect of reality, yet none seems to capture the complete truth. The paradox becomes even more profound when we apply it to time itself. Is time a continuous flow, or is it made up of discrete moments? If continuous, how can anything ever change from one state to another? If discrete, how do we account for the transitions between moments? It's like trying to create motion from a series of still photographs. No matter how many frames you add, you never quite capture the continuous flow of real movement. Consider this practical experiment. Try to identify whether your emotional state right now is continuous or discrete. Are you experiencing a smooth flow of feeling or a series of distinct emotional moments? The more carefully you observe, the more the distinction seems to blur. It's as if emotions exist in a superposition of continuous and discrete states until we try to measure them. This connects back to our earlier paradoxes about consciousness and identity in a fascinating way. If reality itself can be both continuous and discrete simultaneously, what does this mean for our sense of self? Are we continuous beings flowing through time, or are we a series of discrete moments strung together like beads on a string? Perhaps we're both and neither, existing in a state that transcends this dichotomy. As you contemplate this paradox, you might notice something peculiar happening to your perception. The clear boundaries between objects start to feel less solid, while seemingly continuous phenomena start to reveal their discrete nature. It's like developing a kind of double vision that sees both the wave and particle aspects of reality simultaneously. And speaking of simultaneity, our next paradox will challenge everything you think you know about time and causality, taking us even deeper into the mystery of existence itself. But before we move on, consider this. Your very attempt to understand this paradox might be forcing you to perceive it in either continuous or discrete terms, while its true nature might transcend both possibilities. Having explored how reality can be both wave and particle, let's delve into what physicists call the temporal causation paradox. This concept suggests that our basic understanding of cause and effect might be fundamentally flawed, as time itself might not flow in the simple, linear way we imagine. Imagine watching a stone fall into a perfectly still pond. You see the ripples spreading outward from the point of impact. The stone falling caused the ripples, right? But here's where the paradox begins. In certain quantum experiments, the effect appears to precede the cause. It's as if the ripples could appear in the pond before the stone hits the water, challenging our most basic assumptions about how reality works. Consider what we mean when we say, one thing causes another. We assume the cause must come before the effect in time. But quantum entanglement experiments have shown that particles can affect each other instantaneously across any distance, seemingly violating the speed of light and suggesting that some influences don't need to travel through time at all. It's like two dancers perfectly synchronized without any signal passing between them. But here's where it gets truly mind-bending. What if causation doesn't flow through time at all? What if both cause and effect are simply different perspectives on a reality where everything is interconnected outside of time? Think of a circle. Which point comes before another? The concept of before only makes sense if you pick an arbitrary starting point. Consider your own decision-making process. When exactly does the cause, your decision, lead to the effect, your action? Try to catch the precise moment when thought becomes movement. The closer you look, the more the boundary blurs. It's as if cause and effect are so intimately connected that they can't be separated into distinct moments in time. This connects to quantum mechanics in a fascinating way. In the quantum realm, particles can exist in superpositions of different states until observed. But what causes them to collapse into a specific state? And when exactly does this collapse occur? The more precisely we try to pin down the causal relationship, the more it seems to evade our grasp. Think about your memories. We assume our past experiences cause our current memories. But as we've discussed earlier, the act of remembering changes the memory itself. So which is cause and which is effect? Does the past cause your memory? Or does your act of remembering partially create the past you're remembering? It's like trying to determine whether a reflection in a mirror causes the object it's reflecting, or vice versa. The paradox becomes even more profound when we consider consciousness itself. We tend to think our thoughts cause our actions, but neuroscience suggests that our brain often initiates actions before we're consciously aware of deciding to act. So what's really causing what? It's as if the normal flow of causation is running backward, with the effect, brain activity, preceding the cause, conscious decision. But here's where it gets even stranger. What if our entire notion of causation is just a way our minds organize experience? Perhaps, in reality, everything is happening simultaneously, and our brains create the illusion of temporal sequence to make sense of it all. It's like watching a movie. The entire film exists at once on the reel, but we experience it as a sequence of events. Consider this practical experiment. Try to identify the exact cause of your current emotional state. Was it something that happened earlier? But that event was influenced by even earlier events, which were influenced by still earlier ones, creating an infinite regression. Where in this chain is the true cause? It's like trying to find the source of a river that's fed by countless tributaries. As you contemplate this paradox, you might notice something peculiar happening to your perception of time and causality. The clear sequence of cause and effect starts to feel more like a convenient fiction than an absolute truth. It's as if reality is a vast web of interconnections where everything is simultaneously cause and effect to everything else. And speaking of interconnections, our next paradox will challenge everything you think you know about separation and unity, taking us even deeper into the mystery of existence itself. But before we move on, consider this. Your understanding of this paradox might not be caused by reading these words. Perhaps both the understanding and the reading are different aspects of a single reality that exists outside of our conventional notions of cause and effect. Having questioned the nature of cause and effect, let's dive into what philosophers call the unity-separation paradox. This concept suggests that the distinction between being united and being separate might be an illusion created by our limited perspective, as reality might exist in a state that transcends both unity and separation simultaneously. Imagine looking at a rainbow. Where does one color end and another begin? Try to find the exact boundary between orange and yellow or blue and green. The closer you look, the more you realize that what appeared to be distinct colors are actually continuous gradients. But here's where the paradox begins. We can clearly identify different colors, yet we cannot find the boundaries between them. Are they separate or unified? Consider your own body. Where exactly do you end and the rest of the world begin? You might say your skin is the boundary, but your skin is constantly exchanging molecules with the air around it. You're breathing in atoms that were recently part of other things, and breathing out atoms that were recently you. The food you eat becomes you, and parts of you are constantly being shed and replaced. It's like trying to define the edge of a cloud. The more closely you look, the more the boundary dissolves. But here's where it gets truly mind-bending. Apply this thinking to consciousness itself. When you're fully absorbed in reading these words, where does your consciousness end and the meaning of the words begin? When you're deeply engaged in conversation with someone, where does your thought process end and theirs begin? It's as if consciousness itself exists in a state that defies simple categorization as either unified or separate. Think about your relationships with others. We use terms like close and distant to describe relationships. But what do these really mean? When you're thinking about someone you love, is that thought separate from them? When you're influenced by someone's ideas, where does their influence end and your original thought begin? It's like trying to separate the dancer from the dance. They're distinct, yet inseparable. This connects to quantum entanglement in a fascinating way. When particles become entangled, they can no longer be described as separate entities, even when physically far apart. Yet they maintain their distinct properties. They're neither fully unified nor fully separate, but in a state that challenges our basic concepts of individuality and connection. The paradox becomes even more profound when we consider language and meaning. The word tree is separate from an actual tree, yet they're connected through meaning. But where exactly does the meaning reside? Not fully in the word, not fully in the tree, not fully in your mind, yet somehow in the relationship between all three. It's as if meaning itself exists in a space that's neither unified nor separate. Consider this practical experiment. Try to identify where exactly your current thought ends and your next thought begins. You might notice distinct thoughts, yet they flow into each other in a way that makes it impossible to find the exact boundary. It's like trying to catch the moment when day becomes night. There's clearly a difference, yet no definitive point of separation. But here's where it gets even stranger. What if our entire conception of unity and separation is just a convenient fiction created by our minds to make sense of experience? Perhaps reality exists in a state that's neither one nor many, neither unified nor separate, but something our divided minds can only glimpse through paradox. As you sit with this paradox, you might notice something peculiar happening to your perception. The clear boundaries between things start to feel less absolute, while their apparent unity starts to reveal subtle distinctions. It's like developing a new kind of vision that sees both connection and separation simultaneously, without needing to resolve them into one or the other. And speaking of vision, Our next paradox will challenge everything you think you know about perception and reality, taking us even deeper into the mystery of existence itself. But before we move on, consider this. Your very attempt to understand this paradox might be creating an artificial separation between you and the understanding, when in reality, they might be neither separate nor unified, but something else entirely that our divided minds struggle to grasp. Having explored the illusion of boundaries between unity and separation, let's delve into what philosophers call the perception-creation paradox. This concept suggests that the very act of perceiving reality might be what creates the reality we perceive. Yet this reality must somehow exist prior to our perception of it for us to perceive it at all. Imagine looking at a tree. You see its shape, its colors, the way its leaves move in the wind. But what you're actually experiencing is your brain's interpretation of electrical signals from your eyes, which are responding to photons bouncing off the tree. But here's where the paradox begins. What is the tree like before you perceive it? Is it green before eyes evolve to see color? Does it make a sound when falling, if no ears exist to hear it? Consider your current sensory experience. Everything you're aware of, the temperature of the air, the pressure of gravity, the sounds around you, is being actively constructed by your brain. But your brain itself is part of the reality it's constructing. It's like a video game character trying to render the computer it's running on. How can something be both the creator and the creation of its own experience? The paradox deepens when we consider consciousness itself. Your conscious experience seems to be observing reality, but consciousness is itself part of the reality being observed. It's like an eye trying to see itself. The very thing doing the perceiving cannot directly perceive itself because it's the means of perception. Think about how this applies to scientific observation. When scientists observe quantum particles, the act of observation affects the particle's behavior. But here's the mind-bending part. This isn't just true at the quantum level. Every observation, every measurement, every interaction with reality changes the reality being observed. It's like trying to measure the temperature of water with a thermometer. The thermometer itself slightly changes the water's temperature. This connects to neuroscience in a fascinating way. Your brain actively filters and constructs your experience of reality, eliminating most sensory input and creating a workable model of the world. But this model isn't reality itself. It's a useful simulation created by your nervous system. Yet this simulation is all you've ever known. It's like living in a virtual reality so convincing that you've forgotten you're wearing the headset. Consider this practical experiment. Try to experience reality directly, without any mental interpretation or categorization. You'll find it's impossible. The moment you notice something, you've already categorized and interpreted it. The raw data of reality, if it exists at all, is forever hidden behind the veil of perception. It's like trying to taste your own tongue. The very instrument of experience cannot experience itself. But here's where it gets truly mind-bending. If our perception creates our reality, yet must be created by some reality to exist at all, we're caught in an impossible loop. It's like asking which came first, the chicken or the egg, but at a cosmic scale. Does consciousness create reality, or does reality create consciousness? The paradox suggests both must be true simultaneously. Think about memories and anticipation. When you remember the past or imagine the future, you're creating mental constructs that feel real, but these constructs affect how you perceive the present, which in turn affects your memories and expectations. It's like a snake eating its own tail. The cycle of perception and creation has no clear beginning or end. The implications become even more profound when we consider collective perception. If each person's consciousness creates their reality, how do we share a common world? Perhaps what we call objective reality is actually an emergent phenomenon arising from the intersection of billions of subjective realities. It's like a massive multiplayer online game where each player's experience is unique, yet somehow coordinates with all others. As you contemplate this paradox, you might notice something peculiar happening to your awareness. The solid, objective world around you starts to feel more like a dynamic construction, a collaborative hallucination that you're both creating and participating in. It's like becoming aware that you're dreaming while still within the dream. The reality doesn't disappear, but your relationship to it fundamentally changes. And speaking of dreams, our next paradox will challenge everything you think you know about consciousness and reality, taking us even deeper into the mystery of existence itself. But before we move on, consider this. Your understanding of this paradox is itself a perception that's creating a new reality, which in turn is being perceived and creating new understanding in an endless dance of creation and perception. Having explored how perception might create reality, let's dive into what philosophers call the conscious dreaming paradox. This concept suggests that the distinction between waking consciousness and dreaming might be far more complex than we imagine, leading to a paradox where consciousness itself becomes both the dreamer and the dream. Imagine you're having a lucid dream, one where you're aware that you're dreaming. In this state, you're simultaneously the creator of the dream world and a participant within it. But here's where the paradox begins. Who exactly is aware that they're dreaming? Is it your waking consciousness somehow present within the dream? Or is it the dream creating a simulation of awareness? It's like a character in a story becoming aware they're in a story. Does this awareness make them real? Or is the awareness itself part of the fiction? Consider your current state of consciousness. You're presumably awake, reading these words. But how certain are you? In dreams, we're often completely convinced we're awake until we actually wake up. What if this seeming wakefulness is just a more sophisticated level of dream, one so convincing that it never occurs to us to question it? It's like being in a virtual reality simulation so perfect that you've forgotten you're wearing the headset. The paradox deepens when we consider the nature of awareness itself, when you're aware of being aware, as you might be right now. What exactly is happening? Is there a real you observing your consciousness? Or is that meta-awareness itself just another layer of consciousness? It's like mirrors reflecting each other infinitely. Each reflection contains all the others, yet none is the original. Think about how this applies to your daily experience. We tend to think of ourselves as continuous conscious beings, occasionally interrupted by sleep and dreams. But what if it's the other way around? What if consciousness itself is a kind of dream, and what we call waking life is just a particularly persistent and consistent dream that we all somehow share? This connects to quantum mechanics in a fascinating way. Just as quantum particles exist in multiple states until observed, perhaps consciousness exists in multiple states of dreaming and waking simultaneously, only collapsing into one or the other when we try to determine which state we're in. It's like Schrödinger's cat, but instead of being alive or dead, consciousness is both dreaming and awake until observed. Consider this practical experiment. Try to identify the exact boundary between being lost in thought and being aware of your thoughts. You'll find it's impossible to pin down. The moment you try to observe the transition, you've already shifted states. It's like trying to catch yourself falling asleep. The very act of watching prevents what you're trying to observe. But here's where it gets truly mind-bending. What if consciousness itself is neither awake nor dreaming, but something else entirely, that our minds can only comprehend by switching between these two seemingly opposite states? Perhaps waking and dreaming are just different perspectives on a deeper reality that transcends both states. Think about moments of deep absorption when you're completely engrossed in a book, lost in music, or caught up in creative flow. In these states, are you awake or dreaming? You're conscious, but not in the usual way. It's as if consciousness has found a third state that's neither waking nor dreaming, but contains elements of both. The implications become even more profound when we consider collective consciousness. If your individual awareness might be a kind of dream, what about our shared reality? Are we all characters in a collective dream, each convinced of our individual wakefulness? Or are we separate dreamers somehow coordinating our dreams to create the appearance of a shared reality? As you contemplate this paradox, you might notice something peculiar happening to your awareness. The solid distinction between waking and dreaming starts to feel less certain. It's like becoming aware that you're in a dream, but instead of waking up, the dream becomes more real and your wakefulness more dreamlike. And speaking of reality, our next paradox will challenge everything you think you know about existence and non-existence, taking us even deeper into the mystery of consciousness itself. But before we move on, consider this. The very act of questioning whether you're awake or dreaming might be the only truly awakened state possible, a state that transcends both waking and dreaming by embracing the paradox of their inseparability. Having explored the blurry boundary between waking and dreaming, let's delve into what philosophers call the vacuum state paradox. This concept suggests that absolute nothingness is impossible because the very concept of nothingness itself is something, creating a paradox where even perfect emptiness must contain at least itself. Imagine trying to create a perfect vacuum, a space completely devoid of everything. You remove all matter, all energy, all fields. But here's where the paradox begins. Even this empty space would still have properties. It would have dimensions. It would exist in time. It would have the potential to contain things. These properties themselves are something, meaning your perfect nothing still contains something. Consider quantum vacuum fluctuations. Physics tells us that even in the emptiest possible space, particles and antiparticles continuously pop into and out of existence. The vacuum isn't really empty, it's a seething foam of potential existence. But here's the mind-bending part. These fluctuations aren't happening in empty space. They are what empty space is. It's like trying to empty a container of its own containerness. Think about your own consciousness when you try to think about nothing. Even when you imagine complete emptiness, you're still imagining something. The concept of emptiness itself. The very act of conceiving nothingness creates something in your mind. It's like trying to draw a picture of invisibility. The moment you succeed, you've failed. This connects to mathematical infinity in a fascinating way. Just as you can never reach infinity by counting up from zero, you can never reach absolute nothingness by removing things. There's always something left, if nothing else, the potential for something to exist. It's like trying to reduce a number to zero by dividing it in half repeatedly. You'll get ever closer, but never quite reach absolute zero. But here's where it gets truly mind-bending. What if existence itself requires both something and nothing to be possible? Just as a coin needs both heads and tails to be a coin, perhaps reality needs both existence and non-existence to be real. Yet, true non-existence is impossible, creating a paradox where reality must contain its own impossibility to exist. Consider this practical experiment. Try to create absolute emptiness in your mind. First, clear all thoughts. But wait, the awareness of having no thoughts is itself a thought. Clear that too. But now, you're aware of clearing that awareness. Each attempt to create nothing generates something new to be cleared away. It's like trying to bite your own teeth. The very tool you're using prevents you from succeeding. The paradox becomes even more profound when we consider the origin of the universe. Scientists talk about the universe emerging from nothing. But what kind of nothing could give birth to everything? It would need to contain at least the potential for existence, making it not truly nothing. It's like trying to write a story about the absence of all stories. The very act makes its own premise impossible. Think about the spaces between your thoughts. We might think of them as empty moments in consciousness, but these gaps are actually full of the potential for the next thought. Without this pregnant emptiness, no new thoughts could arise. It's like the silence between musical notes, not really empty, but full of the tension and potential that makes music possible. As you contemplate this paradox, you might notice something peculiar happening to your perception of space. The seemingly empty spaces around objects start to feel less empty, more alive with possibility. It's like developing a new sense that detects the fullness of emptiness itself. But here's where it gets even stranger. What if this impossibility of nothingness is what makes existence necessary? If absolute non-existence is impossible, then something must exist. Perhaps existence isn't a mystery to be explained, but rather the inevitable result of the impossibility of nothing. And speaking of impossibilities, our next paradox will challenge everything you think you know about possibility and necessity, taking us even deeper into the mystery of existence itself. But before we move on, consider this. The very fact that you can understand this paradox might be proof of its truth. After all, if absolute nothingness were possible, there would be no one to contemplate its impossibility. Having explored the impossibility of true nothingness, let's dive into what philosophers call the necessity of possibility paradox. This concept suggests that for anything to be possible, everything must be necessary. Yet for anything to be necessary, multiple possibilities must exist, creating an infinite loop of mutual dependence between possibility and necessity. Imagine a universe where only one thing is possible. In such a universe, That one possibility would be necessary, as nothing else could happen. But here's where the paradox begins. For something to be truly possible, alternatives must exist. Without alternatives, we don't have possibility. We have necessity. Yet these alternatives themselves must be possible, which means they too must have alternatives, creating an endless cascade of required possibilities. Consider your next thought. For it to be possible to think something specific, you must have the capacity to think something else. Otherwise, your thought wouldn't be possible. It would be necessary. But for these alternative thoughts to be genuinely possible, they too must have alternatives. It's like trying to create a multiple-choice test where having only one answer makes it no longer a choice at all. The paradox deepens when we consider free will. For a choice to be free, multiple options must be possible. But for these options to be genuinely possible, they must be capable of being chosen, which requires a chooser with free will. It's a perfect circle. Free will requires possibility, but possibility requires free will. Think about the laws of physics. We say they necessarily govern the universe, but for them to be laws, rather than mere descriptions, it must be possible for things to happen differently. Otherwise, we're just observing what must happen rather than what the laws require to happen. Yet if things could happen differently, how can the laws be necessary? This connects to quantum mechanics in a fascinating way. Quantum systems exist in superpositions of multiple possible states until measured, but for these possibilities to exist, the laws allowing superposition must be necessary. Yet, if these laws are necessary, how can multiple possibilities exist? It's like a game where the rules both require and prohibit choices. Consider this practical experiment. Try to imagine something impossible. You might picture a square circle or a married bachelor. But to conceive of impossibility, you must first understand possibility. Yet possibility itself requires the concept of impossibility to have meaning. It's like trying to define light without darkness. Each requires the other to make sense. But here's where it gets truly mind-bending. What if necessity and possibility are not opposites, but rather two perspectives on the same underlying reality? Perhaps what appears necessary from one viewpoint appears possible from another, like how a cylinder can cast both a circular and rectangular shadow. The implications become even more profound when we consider consciousness. For consciousness to be possible, certain necessary conditions must exist. Yet for these conditions to be truly necessary, it must be possible for them to be otherwise. It's like a story that must contain multiple possible endings to be a story at all, yet needs a necessary structure to make those possibilities meaningful. As you contemplate this paradox, you might notice something peculiar happening to your understanding of cause and effect. What seemed like clear chains of necessity start to reveal hidden possibilities, while apparent possibilities start to display underlying necessities. It's like developing double vision, where you see both the necessary and possible aspects of everything simultaneously. And speaking of simultaneity, our next paradox will challenge everything you think you know about time and existence, taking us even deeper into the mystery of reality itself. But before we move on, consider this. Your ability to understand this paradox might be both necessary for it to be possible and possible for it to be necessary, creating a perfect loop of meaning that reflects the paradox itself. Having explored how possibility and necessity intertwine, let's delve into what physicists call the simultaneity dissolution paradox. This concept suggests that the very notion of events happening at the same time might be fundamentally flawed, creating a paradox where time itself seems to both exist and not exist simultaneously. Imagine two lightning bolts striking the ground at what appears to be the same moment. To you, standing midway between them, they seem simultaneous. But according to Einstein's relativity, observers moving at different speeds or in different locations would disagree about which bolt struck first. Here's where the paradox begins. Whose perspective is correct? The unsettling answer is that they all are, making the concept of simultaneity itself relative rather than absolute. Consider your present moment. What exactly is happening now? Your brain takes different amounts of time to process different sensory inputs. Visual information takes longer to process than touch. Yet your consciousness creates the illusion of a unified present moment. It's like watching a delayed video feed while thinking it's live. Your now is actually a carefully constructed illusion combining different temporal points. The paradox deepens when we consider causality. We tend to think cause must precede effect in time. But if simultaneity is relative, then the temporal order of events can differ for different observers. What appears as cause to one observer might appear as effect to another. It's like trying to arrange the pages of a story when each reader sees them in a different order. Yet somehow the story still makes sense. Think about how this applies to consciousness. When exactly are you conscious of something? By the time you become aware of a sensation or thought, the neural activity that created it has already happened. Your conscious experience always lags behind reality, yet you experience it as immediate. It's like watching a sunset that actually occurred 8 minutes ago when the light left the sun. This connects to quantum mechanics in a fascinating way. In quantum entanglement, particles can influence each other instantaneously across any distance, seemingly violating the speed of light. But rather than proving simultaneous action is possible, this might suggest that our entire concept of temporal sequence is fundamentally flawed. Consider this practical experiment. Try to identify the exact moment when your present becomes your past. You'll find it impossible. The very act of trying to observe this transition takes time, during which more present moments have already become past. It's like trying to catch your own shadow. The faster you move, the faster it moves away. But here's where it gets truly mind-bending. What if time itself isn't what we think it is? Instead of a flowing river carrying moments from future to past, what if it's more like a landscape where all moments exist simultaneously, and our consciousness creates the illusion of temporal sequence by how it moves through this landscape? The implications become even more profound when we consider memory and anticipation. Your memories of the past and expectations of the future exist in your present consciousness. But this present is itself relative and constructed. It's like reading a book where every page exists simultaneously, but the act of reading creates the illusion of temporal sequence. As you contemplate this paradox, you might notice something peculiar happening to your perception of time. The solid sequence of moments starts to feel more like a convenient fiction than an absolute truth. It's as if reality is a vast tapestry where all moments exist at once, and what we call time is just our limited way of experiencing this simultaneity. And speaking of limitations, our next paradox will challenge everything you think you know about boundaries and infinity, taking us even deeper into the mystery of existence itself. But before we move on, consider this. The very fact that you can understand this paradox in the present moment might suggest that your consciousness exists somehow outside the time it's trying to comprehend. Having explored how time might be an illusion of consciousness, let's dive into what mathematicians call the boundary infinity paradox. This concept suggests that any attempt to define a boundary creates an infinite regression of smaller boundaries, making true separation fundamentally impossible. Imagine drawing a line on a piece of paper. Simple enough, right? But zoom in close enough, and that line becomes fuzzy, a collection of ink particles with unclear edges. Zoom in further, and even those particles lose their clear boundaries, dissolving into quantum uncertainties. Here's where the paradox begins. Try to define exactly where the line ends, and you'll find that each boundary you draw needs another boundary to define it, ad infinitum. Think about your own physical body. Where exactly does it end? Your skin seems like an obvious boundary, but it's constantly shedding cells and absorbing molecules from the air. Your body temperature extends slightly beyond your skin, creating a thermal boundary. Your electromagnetic field extends further still. It's like trying to define the edge of a cloud. Each boundary you choose is arbitrary and contains infinite possible sub-boundaries. The paradox deepens when we consider consciousness. Where does your consciousness end and the outside world begin? When you're focused on these words, is your consciousness bounded by your skull, your skin, your sensory field, or the meaning you're creating? Each boundary you draw can be questioned and subdivided infinitely. It's like trying to draw a line between dreamer and dream. The very act of drawing the line brings both sides into relationship. This connects to fractal mathematics in a fascinating way. Fractals are shapes that contain infinite detail. Zoom in on any part, and you find the same pattern repeating forever. But this means their boundaries have infinite length while enclosing finite area. It's like coastlines. The more precisely you measure them, the longer they become, potentially extending to infinity. Consider this practical experiment. Try to identify the exact boundary of your current thought. Where does one thought end and another begin? The moment you try to draw that line, you've created a new thought about the boundary, which itself needs boundaries. It's like trying to catch your own reflection, catching itself in a mirror. Each level creates new levels to be caught. But here's where it gets truly mind-bending. What if boundaries themselves are illusions created by our limited perspective? Perhaps reality is fundamentally boundaryless, and what we call boundaries are just useful fictions our minds create to navigate experience. It's like the pixels on a digital screen. Zoom out far enough, and they create clear images with apparent boundaries. But zoom in, and these boundaries dissolve into discrete points. The implications become even more profound when we consider identity. If no true boundaries exist, how can anything have a separate identity? Yet we experience ourselves as distinct beings. Perhaps identity itself is a kind of necessary illusion, a temporary boundary drawn in the boundaryless sea of existence. Think about language and meaning. Each word seems to have clear boundaries of definition. But examine any word closely enough, and its meaning bleeds into other words, creating an interconnected web where no concept can truly stand alone. It's like trying to define a color without reference to other colors. The very act of definition requires transcending the boundaries we're trying to draw. As you contemplate this paradox, you might notice something peculiar happening to your perception. The clear boundaries between things start to feel more like convenient approximations than absolute truths. It's as if reality is a seamless whole that we artificially divide into parts, like cutting up a hologram, where each piece still contains the whole image. And speaking of wholeness, our next paradox will challenge everything you think you know about unity and division, taking us even deeper into the mystery of existence itself. But before we move on, consider this. Your very attempt to understand this paradox is creating temporary boundaries in the boundaryless flow of consciousness, boundaries that dissolve the moment you try to grasp them. Having explored how boundaries dissolve into infinity, let's delve into what philosophers call the unity-division paradox. This concept suggests that true unity can only exist through division, while true division requires underlying unity, creating an impossible loop where each depends on its opposite to exist. Imagine a perfect circle. Its unity depends on every point being exactly the right distance from the center. But to define these points, you must divide the circle into infinitely many locations. Here's where the paradox begins. The circle's unity requires infinite division, yet these divisions only have meaning because of the circle's unity. Each aspect seems to both create and destroy the other. Consider your own unified sense of self. It emerges from billions of neurons firing in complex patterns, countless cells performing different functions, multiple brain regions processing different aspects of experience. Your unity of consciousness depends on this fundamental division of labor. Yet these divisions only function together because of an underlying unity. It's like an orchestra, where the harmony requires separate instruments, yet the separation only makes sense within the unified whole. The paradox deepens when we consider understanding itself. To understand something, we must break it into comprehensible parts. Yet these parts only make sense in relation to the whole we're trying to understand. It's like trying to understand what water is by separating hydrogen and oxygen. The very act of division destroys the unity we're trying to comprehend. This connects to quantum mechanics in a fascinating way. Quantum systems exhibit what physicists call entanglement, where particles become so unified that dividing them is impossible, even when physically separated. Yet this unity only manifests through the interaction of separate particles. It's as if separation and unity are two sides of the same quantum coin. Consider this practical experiment. Try to find anything that is purely unified or purely divided. You'll discover that everything contains both aspects. A single atom is both one thing and a complex system of particles. A thought is both a unified experience and a network of neural connections. It's like trying to find the point where the sky meets the earth. The boundary exists only from certain perspectives. But here's where it gets truly mind-bending. What if unity and division aren't opposites at all, but rather complementary aspects of a deeper reality that transcends both? Perhaps what we see as conflict between unity and division is actually their perfect interdependence, like how a wave requires both peaks and troughs to exist. The implications become even more profound when we consider love and relationship. True intimacy seems to require both unity and separation. Too much unity destroys the possibility of relationship, while too much separation prevents connection. It's like a dance that requires two separate beings moving as one, where neither complete merger nor complete separation would allow a dance to exist. Think about language and meaning. Each word must be separate from other words to have distinct meaning. Yet this meaning only exists within the unity of language as a whole. A single word in isolation has no meaning. It requires the very separation it seems to oppose. It's like trying to play a single note of music in a way that contains no relationship to other notes. As you contemplate this paradox, you might notice something peculiar happening to your perception. Unity and division start to feel less like opposites and more like different perspectives on the same underlying reality. It's as if you're developing a kind of double vision that sees both aspects simultaneously without needing to resolve them into one or the other. And speaking of perspective, our final paradox will challenge everything you think you know about observation and reality, taking us to the ultimate mystery of existence itself. But before we move on, consider this. Your ability to understand this paradox demonstrates both the unity of your consciousness and its capacity for division, a living embodiment of the very paradox you're contemplating. For our final exploration, let's confront what philosophers call the ultimate observer paradox. This last paradox suggests that any attempt to understand the totality of existence creates a new level of existence that must itself be understood, leading to an infinite regression that makes complete understanding logically impossible. Imagine trying to create a complete model of the universe. To be truly complete, this model would need to include itself, since it's part of the universe it's modeling. But then, it would need to include its inclusion of itself, and then include that inclusion, and so on, infinitely. Here's where the final paradox reaches its peak. Any attempt to understand everything must include the understanding itself, creating an endless loop of self-reference. Think about your current attempt to understand all these paradoxes. Your understanding exists within the reality you're trying to understand. But then, you must understand your understanding, which creates a new understanding to be understood. It's like trying to create a map that includes itself. Each time you add the map to the map, you need a larger map to contain the addition. This connects to every paradox we've explored in a fascinating way. The observer paradox, the nature of consciousness, the illusion of time, the impossibility of boundaries. Each reveals another facet of this fundamental impossibility of complete understanding. It's as if reality is structured specifically to prevent its total comprehension, like a cosmic version of Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Consider this final experiment. Try to understand your own understanding. Each level of meta-understanding you achieve creates a new level to be understood. Your consciousness trying to grasp consciousness creates new consciousness to be grasped. It's like a hall of mirrors where each reflection contains all the others, yet none contains the whole. But here's where we reach the ultimate mind-bending possibility. What if this very impossibility of complete understanding is itself the deepest truth we can grasp? Perhaps the universe is structured in a way that makes its complete comprehension impossible, not as a limitation, but as a feature that ensures infinite potential for discovery and wonder. Looking back at our journey through these paradoxes, we can see how each one pointed to this final impossibility. The paradoxes of self, time, consciousness, reality, dreaming, infinity, all revealed different aspects of this fundamental truth, that complete understanding always generates new territory to be understood. As you sit with this final paradox, you might notice something profound happening to your awareness. The frustration of not being able to grasp everything completely transforms into a kind of liberation. It's as if the impossibility of final answers opens up infinite possibilities for exploration and discovery. This isn't just about intellectual understanding, it's about the very nature of existence itself. If reality is structured to prevent its complete comprehension, then existence must be fundamentally creative, always generating new possibilities, new questions, new mysteries to explore. And so we end where we began, with a paradox that contains all paradoxes. The more we understand, the more we understand how much we cannot understand. Yet this very understanding opens up new realms of possibility, new dimensions of mystery, new horizons of exploration. Perhaps this is the ultimate truth. Not a final answer, but an endless invitation to explore, to question, to wonder. In the impossibility of complete understanding, we find the possibility of endless discovery. In the paradox of ultimate observation, we find the freedom to keep observing, keep questioning, keep exploring the infinite mystery of existence itself. Thank you for joining this journey through the mind-bending paradoxes of reality. May these paradoxes continue to expand your mind, challenge your assumptions, and open new possibilities for understanding, not despite their impossibility of resolution, but because of it. Up next, you've got two more standout theory right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.